Hello, I'm Debbie Bell hosking for Finextra TV here at EBAday 2023 in Madrid. And I'm talking to Timo Zwez of Banking Circle. Welcome, Timo.
Good morning, Debbie. How are you?
Very good. And I'm excited to be talking about correspondent banking. There's a big topic, I think, at this year's EBA Day.
It is indeed. And the landscape is changing. And I think we're all conscious of that change. And we just need to, today talk a little bit about the main points that are impacting change. So one of the biggest thing, and we talked about this last year at the same point at the conference, is the de-risking that's happening. So by de-risking, I mean that banks are reevaluating their network based on a risk-reward approach. So that means that banks are looking into this and saying, can we make more money? Is the risk properly evaluated? And that can have various outputs. It could be the output of increasing prices, to reflect the higher risk. It could be the output to reduce services. And worst case scenario, it could be the output that you're actually exiting a client, which is not ideal in this world. Another interesting point is owed to the world, unfortunately, that we're living in. So we are seeing an enhanced due diligence requirement that has to do with mitigating of risks. So banks are doing a much deeper dive into the client base of the correspondents to understand the risks associated. And that can also lead to some sort of an exclusion and reduction of services. Another interesting trend is obviously the digitalization that happens. And digitalization is such a big word. But I think the topics that I would say are driving the trend is obviously the blockchain as an alternative means to transfer money across borders. And then also artificial intelligence, machine learning that can enhance systems. I mean, at Banking Circle, we are using artificial intelligence, for instance, for our transaction monitoring, which is good and improves, the system in general. And then also beyond this, obviously, the regulatory environment that's changing a lot. So when it comes to anti-money laundering issues, fraudulent crime, etc., these are trends that banks need to be very focused on and adhere to be compliant.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And what about sanctions? How are they impacting correspondent banking?
Yeah, sanctions, as I mentioned earlier, this is a big topic. And I think over the last 12 to 18 months, we've all been exposed to it in a strong way. And we had to react very quickly to it. I think the challenge here is, first of all, operational. I think, when you have this kind of overnight action, you as a bank need to have the power in place to change and to adopt quickly operational. And I think that's a big challenge. But also, increases the risk, right? So it's a risk from, not being compliant or missing out on something, and that, could lead to a fine or reputational damage, also not ideal. And then obviously the outcome, as I said earlier, I mean, de-risking. You look at the risk and saying the risk is not suitable anymore for me. You are exiting clients, worst case scenario. And then again, you want to evaluate your risk properly. So you do more due diligence, which is cumbersome, time consuming and stressful for both sides. So there are elements to it. And, unfortunately, that's the world we're living in. I think banks in general need to prepare for that. So banks need to have the proper people in place. They need to invest into the systems. They need to have a forward-looking approach to it to cope with that burden that's happening now.
And of course, there are changing business models and new markets. What are your thoughts on those? Can you enlighten us a bit?
Well, that's an interesting bit because I've been talking a lot about client-centric approach. And I think when we talk a little bit about, what are we actually doing in banking is we need to remind ourselves that we serve a client. And now I come to the point to the new business models. This is driven by challenges, by new banks that are actually focusing on this part. So they want to enhance the client experience. And the client is not, us again, unfortunately. It's much younger these days. It's much more, challenging because they have a different lifestyle. So they look much more into, transparency, efficiencies. They want also to have, when they travel, they want to have access to their funds locally, and so forth and so forth. That is bringing a challenge to the system and impacting the way we do banking. And last but not least, new technology, right? I mean, the blockchain, Web3, these kind of things are being standard for the younger generations, and they ask for it. And these new banks, the challenges, they cater for that, and that impacts the system. The downside here is a little bit that at the moment it's small, right? So these are, geographical focuses. These banks are not global yet. And also a challenge for the neo and challenge banks is sometimes they're using partner banks and that legacy system. So we are not optimizing the whole value chain, we're just optimizing the front end, and the back end is still old. And then the other technology, I wouldn't call it technology, the other trend is actually Web3, so the blockchain technology that is here to rival the whole system, right? So it's an alternative to transfer money across borders without using the classical network. And it's a great system because it helps. I think it helps society also for when it comes to financial exclusion. Just think about what's out there. You have, areas where there's not a bank at each corner, right? So you have unbanked nations, and this technology could be an enabler to help us to grow and to give access to these underbanked nations also and underbanked people. But again, and I'm stopped there because I'm very passionate about this. But again, it's not there yet. So we're not at the point where you actually can, roll it out and it's fully secured, it's fully regulated. I mean, there's a lot of question marks in terms of, what will happen in the future, which cryptocurrency will be the dominant one, how is the government supporting that, and so forth and so forth. But I think it's an interesting technology that we should have an eye on, and it will rival cross-border payments and the classical network that we have.
And it's so interesting to hear all of this. So as we bring this interview to a close, very briefly, what do you think what is your outlook for correspondent banking?
I think, it will stay, right? It will definitely grow. I mean, just look at, global trade that is growing. I mean, we can talk about, globalization, which has slowed down a little bit, but I think it will continue to grow. And also then you look at all these emerging market nations, they are not even close to where we are in the developed world. So that will grow and accelerate. And last but not least, the digitalization, the new technologies, the new approaches, the new generations, they will push that element. So I think, first of all, it's here to stay. We will have add-ons, but we will see a lot of improvements. I think the most important one, given the area that we're in, is obviously the whole topic about rules, regulations, sanctions, money laundering, just to shore up the system properly, to make it adoptable to other areas, to connect new technologies into this old world, let's call it, and be compliant with framework and work forward-looking on issues.
Wow. So there's a lot to look towards, but a lot to do now as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a very exciting place to be, actually. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to share my thoughts.
Lovely, and it's been wonderful talking to you, Timo. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.